Not really, because I'd already by that time seen films by women that had a formative impression on me. So I'd seen Hotel Monterey, I'd seen Yvonne Rayner's Lives of the Performers. I'd met Chantal when she came for the series of international experimental films at the National Film Theatre in London, and we got to know each other, and she didn't like the place where she was staying, so she came to stay with Peter and me. So when I saw Jeanne Dielman, I was surprised. I thought it was the most extraordinary film. I've said so often now, it's become a cliché, but so I can say it again for you as a cliché. It felt as though, just as there'd been a before and after Citizen Kane, there was a before and after Jeanne Dielman. So as a film, it was a shock, but it seemed at that point very much part of what was happening, in that women's films were being made out of a consciousness of the women's movement, which meant that films were being made of a kind that had never ever been made before. Of course, women had made films. They'd made art films, they'd made short films, Dorothy Arzner had made industrial films. But films made out of a kind of collective consciousness of the women's movement was something totally new. And there weren't very many people making these movies, but it was enough to feel that something was starting. So when I saw Jeanne Dielman, in a way it was a surprise, but not a surprise. It felt very appropriate for the moment. What made me want to pick up the camera? That too was an accident. You're quite right in the first instance that it was the desire to change, to translate theory, written theory into practical theory. And Peter Wollen and I both were writing essays, and we wanted then to make what we called theory films. Nowadays they would be called essay films. And so there was very much that sense for both of us, I think, of translating theory into practice. But of course, we had no idea really what that meant when we first picked up the camera. I suppose I would say, in an English expression, about time too. But in the UK, or actually really in London, because Nos Amours was really using exhibition spaces in London, I think it made a difference. I think it built up an audience and a following for the Akerman films. And it took a long, long time, because Joanna and Adam were so rigorous. They would only show the material in the correct format. So what with the difficulty of accessing the format and the difficulty of finding an exhibition space that would show it, it was a long process. And over those, I think it was about 2 years for the retrospective to be completed. And during that time, they built up a consciousness and a following. And it was also a retrospective that was an homage to Chantal Akerman, but it was also very much a promotion. So the handbook that you just showed me was really designed to make her films materially accessible, so that it would be possible for other people, for it to spread like waves out from this beginning out into the world. So I think it did make a difference. The sight and sound phenomenon is interesting. There'd been a build-up over the last few years, decades, because they only do the greatest films of all time every 10 years. And I'd been putting Jan Dielman on my list over, I think it was the 3 decades that I'd been there. So had other people. So there'd been a kind of building up consciousness of the film. But then 2 things happened. One, they extended the number of people who were polled massively. So instead of being a small elite of male critics, which it had originally been for 50 or so plus years, it then became, I would say everybody, but massively expanded beyond critics into academia. And with that expansion, it touched a different kind of consciousness. But also there's a story I could tell you, which I think is indicative. A very dear friend of mine, about my age, so he must be about 80 as well. I've known him since the 60s, I think. And he's been doing the poll every single decade, well, for a long time. He told me this story, that this year he did his list as usual, and he showed it to his daughter and said, "What do you think?" She said, "You can't give this in. This is impossible." He said, "Why? I don't understand." She said, "There's no film directed by a woman on your list." He said, "Oh dear, what should I do about that?" She said, "Go away and watch Jan Dielman." He was amazed. Ébloui, you say in French, and it immediately went into his list. In my experience, audiences are much more receptive now than they were when the film was first exhibited. So, for instance, if in the 1980s, if I showed it in class, the class found it very difficult. And they would say, "I'm sorry, I've got to go and have a cigarette," or "I've got to go to the loo." They couldn't sit still. Nowadays, I find that people understand that it's a suspense movie, and that if you lose a moment of the suspense, you'll lose the élan of the whole thing. And they're completely gripped by it.
And why do you think that is? That it's so different?
Perhaps it's because they don't smoke anymore. I think that also the concept of cinema as a 90-minute feature film has been dispersed, and cinema is now all kinds of different things. And I think people are more receptive to different kinds of experience. But it's also, once you allow yourself to be taken over by it, it's a very compelling film, and as I say, there's a lot of suspense in it.